Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Monday, November the 7th. And welcome to our commentary. Over the next couple of days, the next 48 hours, we will be voting in the United States. Many people have already voted. I myself voted early here in Texas, but millions and millions of people will be voting on Tuesday. And over the next 48 hours, we'll have a good idea of what's going to happen. All of the experts, all of the pundits, all of the people who do the numbers are saying that the Republicans are going to have a very good day. Now, it is traditional for the party in power, or the party of the president, I should say, to do poorly in the first midterm elections. So we've seen this before where the president loses a lot of members, or sometimes he loses one house, or sometimes he loses the House and the Senate. So that in itself is not an unusual thing. It's happened before. The question this year is, how big is the Republican victory going to be? A lot of the so-called experts are saying 35 in the House. I happen to agree with that. That's the number that I am putting down: 35 seats in the House. The Senate is always more controversial, more difficult, because obviously we vote. Not everybody in the Senate is up for reelection at the same time. So it depends what states are up for reelection. And right now, again, according to the experts, the Republicans are going to have a majority when it's all said and done. The question is it going to be 52, 53, 54? Is the majority going to be in a number like that? I believe it's going to be 53. That's what I think is going to happen. And that's because I believe the Republicans will keep Pennsylvania, win Georgia, win Nevada, and win Arizona to come up with 53. There is an outside chance, and I want to make sure I underline outside chance, because it's 50-50 right now up in New Hampshire. And the Republican candidate up there he is really campaigning quite well. So there's a chance it could be 54. And if the wave is really big, then you could have 54, 55, who knows, 56 senators. That could happen. It's happened before. 1980 is a good example of that. 1980, 1994, years that when you have a wave and the wave just changes the political terrain. We don't know exactly what's going to be, so we'll wait and see what the voters have to say on all of this. We'll do an analysis, of course, of all of this on Wednesday. Just a quick reminder, we have in the inventory of podcasts, we have an interview with Barry Kasselman. We did that on Friday, talking about the elections and particularly the Senate. And then on Sunday night, we recorded a video and a podcast with our friend George Rodriguez from South Texas. And we looked at Texas and how Texas is going to do. Both of us feel that Governor Abbott will be reelected and that the Republicans will do well in Texas in 2022. So all of this, of course, the answer to all of this, we will know in the next 48 hours. One of the reasons that I like the first couple of weeks in November is because we get to go back and celebrate anniversaries of elections in the past, consequential elections in the past. So on today's video, as well as Tuesday's video, we're going to be looking back at a couple of presidential and congressional elections that were very consequential. And today I want to talk about 1972. 50 years ago today, President Richard Nixon was reelected, and he was reelected with a huge landslide, something like 61% of the popular vote. He carried 49 states. I mean, if you look at the map, it's a completely red map from coast to coast. And the story of 1972 is rather interesting because Richard Nixon himself had lost the 1960 election to John Kennedy. And then in 1968, he came back and he won a three-way race against Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. And, Nixon was a controversial president. The left didn't like him. There was a war going on in Vietnam that was extremely unpopular. And that war really had a lot to do with why Lyndon Johnson did not seek re-election. in 1968, and it had a lot to do with why Richard Nixon was elected in 1968. His presidency was, I think, fairly good by historical standards. He seems to be improving more and more as time goes by, as people look at the whole picture, not just Watergate. But by 1972, at the beginning of 1972, President Nixon was looking ahead to re-election, and he was doing certain things very well. He was bringing down the war in Vietnam. In fact, by the summer of 1972, the war in Vietnam was pretty much over. We had troops in Vietnam, but they were not doing the bulk of the fighting. The number of troops had gone down from 500,000 at the beginning of his term to about 20,000 by election day. So yes, on one hand, Vietnam was a topic of the campaign, but the reality is that most Americans could see for themselves that the war was winding down. So the number one argument that the Democrats had against Richard Nixon by election day wasn't much of an argument anyway. A couple of other things that Richard Nixon did that year. He went to China and, in a sense, opened that chapter of American diplomacy. And he also made some deals with the Soviet Union over nuclear weapons. So he was projecting himself in the summer of 1972 as a statesman, as a foreign policy president. On the other hand, the Democrats were still falling apart from the 1968 convention. Their party was deeply divided, and George McGovern became the nominee. McGovern himself was not a radical lefty, not at all. He was more of what I would call left-center type Democrat, but he was not anywhere near a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or anybody like that. But he became associated with the anti-war movement and had to take some positions that I think made him look farther to the left than what he really was. He also had some problems with his vice president. Anyway, by the time people voted on election day, it was hands down Richard Nixon, and he was reelected in huge numbers. But here's the interesting thing about that election. When you look at the map of the United States, the electoral map of the United States that came out of that election of 1972, that map has been incredibly consistent over the last 50 years. And I'm talking about the red states, with the exception of Jimmy Carter in 1976 and a couple of Clinton victories along the way. That map has been extremely consistent, the red and the blue states. Sometimes there are more red states than blue states, but much of that map that we saw in 1972 was the same map that elected Reagan, that reelected Reagan, that elected the first Bush, that elected George W. Bush, that reelected George W. Bush, and then elected Donald Trump. And that map came about because of the 1972 elections, when we had a political realignment in the country, and that realignment made the South and the West much more Republican than they had been in the past. So that election of 1972 was an election that had profound consequence on our politics and how people vote in the United States. Take a look at the map. Take a look at the map yourself of the 1972 election and compare that map with Reagan, 1980, 1984, the first Bush, 1988, or the other two times that George W. Bush ran, and you'll see how similar the map is. All those red states going Republican and those blue states going Democrat. That started with Nixon, and it started with Nixon on this day in 1972. So the election of 1972, we remember that election. You know, I remember reading a book by the fellow White, who wrote books about elections. I can't quite remember his name right now, but he wrote The Making of the President. There are several books that he wrote about the making of the president. And he wrote one about the 1972 election that I really think it's worth reading. I remember reading it back then. And it's one of those books you may want to pick up from time to time and read it again, because the point that Mr. White was making in that book is that 1972 was changing the electorate, and the electorate was becoming more conservative and much more in tune with ideas that made the Republican Party of today, Reagan, Bush, and all the others who followed. So 1972, 50 years ago today, it wasn't much of a suspense. The election was over by 8 or 9 o'clock. Richard Nixon, reelected in huge numbers. I mean, huge numbers, not just in the Electoral College, but even the popular vote. We haven't had one president since that election of Richard Nixon in 1972 break the 60% mark. Reagan came pretty close. Reagan was like 59.9, I think. But Richard Nixon was the only one in the last 50 years who has broken the 60% mark, capturing more, I think it was like 61% of the popular vote that year. I mean, it was a landslide of huge proportions. So check out the interview that we did with Barry Castleman about the upcoming midterms, the interview that we did with George Rodriguez about the Texas elections. And as I say, we'll come back on Tuesday and do a little election analysis, but focus on a couple of other important elections. And then on Wednesday, we're going to really get into the 2022 elections and at least tell you our thoughts as to what happened and what and why. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later.